At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on July the 13th, 2026, the Korea Meteorological Administration made a quiet announcement that closed the book on one of the most violent storms the Western Pacific had produced in years. Typhoon Bavi, it said, had dissipated over the Chinese mainland, collapsing into nothing more than a tropical depression. Just 8 days earlier, that same system had been a maximum strength monster with sustained winds of 180 miles an hour and a central pressure of 901 millibars, a number so low it placed Bavi within reach of the theoretical limit of what a tropical cyclone can physically become. The storm that died quietly over the rice paddies and industrial towns of eastern China had, only a week before, torn the roof off nearly every building on a small island most people had never heard of. To understand how a storm that powerful could end so unremarkably, you have to go back to where it began, and then walk forward, hour by hour, through the final days of its life. Bavi's story starts far from any headline. In the open ocean, roughly 900 nautical miles east-southeast of Kwajalein Atoll, a spit of land in the Marshall Islands that most maps barely bother to label. On June the 25th, 2026, satellite analysts at the Joint Typhoon Warning Center noticed a shapeless cluster of thunderstorms drifting over unusually warm water. There was nothing dramatic about it. It was the kind of disturbance that meteorologists log dozens of times a season, most of which fizzle out within 48 hours. This one did not fizzle. Sea surface temperatures in that stretch of the Pacific were running 2 to 3 degrees Celsius above normal for early July, and the upper atmosphere above it was almost eerily calm, with wind shear close to zero. Warm water is the fuel for a tropical cyclone, and calm upper-level winds are what allow that fuel to be burned efficiently, without the storm's rising heat engine being torn apart before it can organize. Every ingredient a meteorologist would want for something dangerous to develop was present in that patch of ocean, and the atmosphere took full advantage of it. 4 days later, on June the 29th, the Joint Typhoon Warning Center issued a formal tropical cyclone formation alert, the bureaucratic equivalent of a starting gun. 3 days after that, the system was designated Tropical Depression 09W. And on the 2nd of July, the Japan Meteorological Agency gave it the name that would end up in the record books, Bavi. At that point, it was still a relatively ordinary tropical storm with winds around 60 miles an hour, unremarkable except to the handful of professionals whose job it is to watch these things and worry. What happened over the next 48 hours was not ordinary at all. Bavi began to feed on the extraordinarily warm water beneath it, and in a display that meteorologists would later describe as a rare and almost textbook case of rapid intensification, it exploded from a 60-mile-an-hour tropical storm into a full typhoon, and then within the same stretch of that Thursday and Friday, into a Category 5 equivalent super typhoon. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern Time on July the 3rd, Bavi had become the third storm anywhere on Earth to reach Category 5 strength that year, with sustained winds of 160 miles an hour. It did not stop there. Over the following day, as it churned west-northwest across water measured at 29 to 32 degrees Celsius, some of the warmest ocean temperatures anywhere on the planet at that latitude, Bavi kept strengthening. Satellite loops showed a wide, strikingly symmetrical eye beginning to carve itself into the storm's center, eventually widening to about 25 nautical miles across, roughly 29 miles in diameter. A clean, almost architectural feature that told forecasters this was now an extremely efficient and extremely dangerous machine. The storm underwent what is known as an eyewall replacement cycle, a natural process in which an inner ring of thunderstorms collapses and is replaced by an outer one, briefly weakening the storm before it reorganizes, often emerging even larger than before. That is exactly what happened. Bavi weakened slightly overnight on July the 4th, then rapidly rebuilt itself into an even bigger and more dangerous system heading directly for the United States territory of the Northern Mariana Islands. To understand why Bavi intensified the way it did, it helps to think of a tropical cyclone as a heat engine, one that draws its energy from the temperature difference between warm ocean water at the surface and much colder air high in the atmosphere. The wider that temperature gap, and the less resistance the storm meets from crosswinds tearing at its structure, the more efficiently that engine can run. In Bavi's case, nearly every variable lined up in the storm's favor at once. Sea surface temperatures were not simply warm, they were warm to a significant depth, meaning the storm could not easily churn up cooler water from below to sap its own strength, a self-limiting process that ends the growth of many otherwise promising systems. Upper-level winds, meanwhile, were about as calm as forecasters ever see them in that part of the Pacific, allowing the storm's outflow, the exhaust of its heat engine, to vent cleanly in every direction without being sheared apart. Meteorologists sometimes describe this combination as a storm's environment being maximally favorable, and it is a phrase used sparingly because it is rare for every ingredient to align this cleanly at the same time. When it does, the result is what happened to Bavi, a jump from tropical storm strength to Category 5, equivalent in a period of roughly 48 hours, a rate of intensification that meteorologists classify as extreme even by the standards of a warming ocean that has, in recent years, produced more of these events than in decades past. By the 5th of July, the Joint Typhoon Warning Center was reporting maximum sustained winds near 166 miles an hour, with gusts reaching 200 miles an hour, and a central pressure that had fallen to 919 millibars and was still dropping. Forecasters at the time said satellite imagery showed an extremely powerful super typhoon steadily approaching the Mariana Islands, and they were not exaggerating. Some forecast models were suggesting Bavi could still strengthen further, with winds potentially climbing as high as 184 miles an hour. Guam's governor moved the island into a heightened state of emergency readiness. Authorities warned residents to expect 8 to 12 inches of rain, with the potential for dangerous flash flooding layered on top of catastrophic wind. All flights out of Guam's airports were grounded. Port operations across the region were suspended. Emergency shelters opened across Guam, Rota, Tinian, and Saipan, and within hours, many of them were already nearing capacity as families living in older wood frame or tin-roofed homes sought somewhere safer to ride out the storm. What made Bavi especially frightening in those final approach hours was not only its intensity, but its size. As the storm plowed northwest, it continued to balloon outward, and the Joint Typhoon Warning Center later determined that Bavi's wind field ranked in the top 3% of every Western Pacific typhoon recorded over the previous decade. Its gale force winds, according to Japan's meteorological agency, extended out roughly 750 kilometers from the center at their widest point, a radius large enough that if you dropped the storm onto a map of Japan, its outer winds would have reached from one end of the country to the other. Hurricane-force winds alone stretched more than 50 miles to the north of the center and roughly 46 miles to the south, while tropical storm-force winds spread out to 230 miles north and around 180 miles south. This was not a compact surgical strike. This was an entire weather system large enough to swallow an island chain whole. The blow fell just after sunrise, local time on Monday, July the 6th. The eye of Super Typhoon Bavi tracked directly over the small island of Rota, home to roughly 1,900 people, at almost the exact moment the storm reached its absolute peak strength. The Japan Meteorological Agency measured that peak at 205 kilometers per hour, about 125 miles an hour, sustained over 10 minutes with a central pressure of 910 hectopascals. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center, which measures sustained wind over 1 minute rather than 10, put the number even higher, 285 kilometers per hour, roughly 180 miles an hour, with a central pressure that had bottomed out at 901 millibars. To put that pressure reading in context, meteorologists who studied the storm afterward noted it came remarkably close to the theoretical maximum potential intensity a cyclone could achieve, given the ocean and atmospheric conditions present that week, an intensity ceiling estimated at around 200 miles an hour with a central pressure near 885 millibars. Reaching that ceiling requires nearly perfect conditions, sustained over days, something that happens only rarely in any given storm's lifetime. Bavi very nearly touched it. Between 6 and 7 in the evening Eastern Time that Sunday, as the eye of the storm rolled over Rota, radar images captured something unusual embedded within the western eyewall, a scalloped, almost lace-like pattern that experienced storm researchers recognized as the signature of mesoscale vortices, tornado-scale spin-ups embedded inside the eyewall itself, similar to structures first documented by a Hurricane Hunter aircraft flying into Hurricane Hugo back in 1989. In plain terms, within the already extreme winds of the eyewall, there were smaller, even more violent pockets of rotation passing directly over Rota's homes, roads, and harbor as the island's 1,900 residents sheltered in place. Wind gusts of 111 miles an hour were recorded 70 miles away at Saipan's International Airport, giving some sense of just how far Bavi's violence extended beyond its own core. The damage on Rota was, in the words of the island's own mayor afterward, damage to virtually every aspect of the island's infrastructure. Power poles snapped, and lines came down across the island. A water distribution station was damaged, threatening the island's access to clean water in the storm's aftermath. Roads were flooded and buried under debris. On Guam, 60 miles to the southwest, Opera Harbor, the island's main port and a critical hub for military and commercial shipping, was forced to close entirely for channel inspections after navigation aids were torn loose and marine communications equipment was knocked out. Container cranes needed repair before cargo operations could resume. The United States Coast Guard led a staged, careful reopening of the ports across the region, restricting Tinian's harbor to daylight-only operations, while inspection teams worked to confirm the waterways were safe to navigate again. Guam International Airport recorded 15.68 inches of rain between July the 4th and the 5th alone, a staggering total that turned low-lying roads into rivers even before the worst of the wind arrived. This was, painfully, the second time in 3 months that the Northern Mariana Islands had been struck by a violent typhoon, Super Typhoon. Sinlaku had crossed the same islands in mid-April, leaving behind its own trail of destructive wind and flooding, an event that had caused an estimated $1.5 billion in damage and 17 deaths across the region. Communities that were still repairing roofs, restoring power lines, and rebuilding docks from Sinlaku now found themselves facing an even stronger storm barreling toward the exact same stretch of ocean. Despite the ferocity of Bavi's winds, major loss of life on the islands themselves was limited, a testament to decades of hard-earned lessons in construction and evacuation practice on Guam, much of it traced back to an earlier storm named Karen in 1962, which was so destructive that it permanently changed how homes were built across the island, shifting the territory from a landscape of wooden houses to what residents now proudly call a concrete island. Guam and its neighboring islands sit in a stretch of ocean that meteorologists have long nicknamed Typhoon Alley, a corridor of the Western Pacific that produces more intense tropical cyclones than almost anywhere else on the planet. Names like Karen, Pamela, Paka, and Pongsona are still spoken of with a certain weight by longtime residents, each one a benchmark storm that reshaped how the islands built and prepared. Bavi joined that list in a single night, and by several measures it surpassed what came before it, becoming, by some assessments, the first storm on record whose eye passed directly and completely over the small island of Rota at full Category 5 strength. For an island of fewer than 2,000 people, absorbing a direct hit from a storm operating near its maximum theoretical intensity is not simply a matter of bad luck, it is closer to drawing the single worst card available in the entire deck of possible tropical weather. That the island's death toll remained limited, even as infrastructure damage was near total, speaks to years of investment in reinforced concrete construction, coordinated evacuation planning, and a regional weather warning system built specifically, because the alternative, learning that lesson the hard way, has already been paid for in decades past. By Monday afternoon local time, the worst of the eyewall had pulled away from the Marianas, though dangerous winds continued to lash the islands for hours afterward. Bavi resumed its long march west-northwest across the open waters of the Philippine Sea, still a powerful system, but no longer at its absolute peak. Late on July the 7th, the Philippine weather agency Pagasa assigned the storm its own local name, Inday, in anticipation of it entering the Philippine area of responsibility, which it officially did, in the very early hours of July the 8th. Bavi's outer bands, sweeping across the southern Philippines even before the center arrived, triggered heavy rain, flash flooding, and landslides across the region, with the most severe consequences striking the southern island of Mindanao. Rescue teams spent days combing through mud and debris, and the eventual toll from those landslides and related flooding across the Philippines climbed to 23 people dead, with 18 more left missing. A grim reminder that a typhoon's most dangerous statistic is rarely wind speed alone, but the water it drags along behind it. As it crossed the Philippine Sea, Bavi went through the fluctuations typical of a large, long-lived system moving over uneven pockets of ocean heat and shifting shear. It weakened somewhat after leaving the Marianas, with sustained winds dropping to around 145 miles an hour by the stroke of midnight, coordinated time on July the 7th. But the ocean beneath it had not finished feeding it yet. Within another day, Bavi re-intensified back into super typhoon strength, though not quite reaching the ferocity of its Rota landfall, with sustained winds climbing back to around 155 miles an hour by midnight on the 8th. It was, in effect, a storm with two lives, dying down and then roaring back before finally beginning its long terminal decline. This kind of up-and-down fluctuation is common in large, long-lived typhoons, and it is driven largely by the same eyewall replacement process that had briefly interrupted Bavi's growth days earlier near the Marianas. As a storm's inner eyewall contracts and intensifies, it can eventually become unstable, choking off its own inflow of warm, moist air. An outer band of thunderstorms then organizes into a second eyewall, gradually squeezing the original one until it collapses entirely, briefly weakening the storm's peak winds, even as its overall wind field expands. Once the new eyewall consolidates, the storm can often re-intensify, sometimes to a lesser peak than before, sometimes, if conditions are favorable enough, right back to where it started. Bavi went through versions of this cycle more than once during its life, which helps explain why its intensity chart, if plotted on a graph, would not look like a single smooth curve rising to a peak and falling away, but more like a jagged mountain range, climbing sharply to its high point over Rota, dipping, climbing again over the open Philippine Sea, and only then beginning its long, steady decline toward the Asian coast. That decline played out over Taiwan and Japan's southernmost islands before Bavi ever reached the Asian mainland. The storm's outer structure battered Japan's remote Sakishima island chain, part of the southern Ryukyu Islands, toppling trees and knocking out power to tens of thousands of residents. It then swept just north of Taiwan without making a direct landfall on the island, but the government there was not taking any chances, given forecasts calling for as much as 1 meter, roughly 3 feet of rain in some mountainous regions. More than 14,000 people were evacuated, most of them from mountainous areas in the island's north and east. Taiwan's main international gateway at Taoyuan, just outside Taipei, was effectively shut down as more than 920 international flights were canceled. Taiwan's fire department later reported 113 injuries connected to the storm, the overwhelming majority of them not from flying debris or structural collapse, but from people falling off motorcycles and bicycles in the wind and rain, or simply being knocked off their feet by gusts while trying to get somewhere safe. By the time Bavi turned its attention fully toward mainland China, it had already been downgraded from the ferocious super typhoon that had devastated Rota. But it remained an enormous and genuinely dangerous storm, both because of its sustained strength and because of the sheer volume of moisture packed into its rain bands so wide that forecasters at the time compared their overall footprint to the size of France, stretched from end to end. China's National Weather Service issued an orange typhoon alert, the second highest level on the country's 4-tier warning scale, and authorities began one of the largest coordinated evacuations of the storm's entire path. Nearly 2 million people were moved out of the projected strike zone in Zhejiang province in the days before landfall, with later tallies putting the total closer to 2.4 million once neighboring areas were included. Hundreds of flights were canceled, rail service was scaled back, and schools and ferry operations across the region were suspended well in advance of the storm's arrival. In Wenzhou, one of the province's densely packed cities, residents were reported stocking up on 2 to 3 days' worth of water and food, treating the approaching storm with the same grim practicality coastal communities the world over bring to a known and recurring threat. Coordinating the movement of nearly 2.5 million people in the span of a few days is not a simple administrative exercise, and the scale of it is worth pausing on. It meant clearing out coastal fishing communities, moving elderly residents out of low-lying apartment blocks, shutting down entire industrial districts along the Zhejiang coastline, and rerouting freight and passenger rail traffic across one of the most economically productive regions of China. Container shipping backed up at ports up and down the coast as vessels were moved to safer anchorages or held at sea to ride out the storm rather than risk being caught at dock. For a province that manufactures and ships an enormous share of the goods that move through global supply chains, even a temporary shutdown of this scale carries costs that ripple outward for weeks, long after the wind itself has died down. Local businesses shuttered their doors early, and images from cities like Wenzhou showed shoppers moving briskly through wet markets in the hours before closure, buying the essentials that experience had taught them to stock, ahead of any storm carrying this kind of warning level. Bavi made its final landfall at around 11:20 at night local time on Saturday, July the 11th, near the town of Yuhuan on the coast of Zhejiang province, not far from the city of Taizhou. By the time the center crossed the coastline, its sustained winds had fallen to roughly 144 kilometers an hour, about 90 miles an hour, placing it at the equivalent of a Category 1 storm on the scale typically used for Atlantic hurricanes, a small fraction of the violence it had unleashed on Rota barely a week earlier. Even so, this was still a storm capable of real damage, and eastern China had already been softened up by an unusually harsh stretch of weather in the days before Bavi arrived. Separate storms in the preceding week had left at least 39 people dead across southern and central China, overflowed dozens of rivers, and even burst a reservoir. Bavi was, remarkably, the second typhoon to strike China within roughly a week, following closely on the heels of an earlier storm named Maisak that had come ashore farther south. This is where Bavi entered its true final hours, the slow, grinding death that every landfalling tropical cyclone eventually experiences once it loses contact with the warm ocean water that had sustained it for nearly 2 weeks. Strong winds tore through Zhejiang, uprooting trees that crashed down onto roads and tangled power lines. Parts of the region flooded quickly as intense rain bands, still organized and still carrying tropical moisture despite the weakening wind field, dumped enormous totals over a landscape already saturated from the prior week's storms. In some low-lying neighborhoods, the flooding rose high enough that rescue workers had to use boats to reach residents trapped in their homes. Remarkably, in the immediate aftermath of landfall, there were no confirmed casualties directly tied to the Chinese landfall itself, a fact authorities attributed to the scale and speed of the evacuation that had emptied nearly 2.5 million people out of the storm's path in the days before it arrived. By Sunday, July the 12th, Bavi had already been downgraded from typhoon status to a severe tropical storm as it continued pushing inland, its circulation steadily disorganizing the farther it moved from the ocean. Forecasters at that point said the greatest remaining danger was no longer wind, but water. Flooding and landslides across eastern Zhejiang and northeastern Fujian, driven by rainfall totals that remained exceptionally heavy even as the wind field collapsed. The storm's structure, once a taut symmetrical engine capable of reaching 901 millibars at its Pacific peak, was now a smeared, disorganized mass of rain sliding slowly across the Chinese interior, cut off from the warm water that had once made it one of the most powerful storms on the planet that year. The system's last gasps came quickly after that. The Joint Typhoon Warning Center issued what would be its final advisory on the storm as Bavi weakened into a remnant low-pressure area over eastern China, its winds down to roughly 45 kilometers an hour, a small fraction of the 290 kilometers an hour it had carried at its Category 5 peak over Rota barely a week before. Forecasters at the time noted the system was decaying steadily inland and expected it to dissipate entirely within 24 to 48 hours, with flooding across eastern Zhejiang and Fujian remaining the last significant hazard tied to what was left of the storm. And that is precisely what happened. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon on July the 13th, the Korea Meteorological Administration confirmed that Typhoon Bavi had dissipated over the Chinese mainland, its circulation finally unraveling into a weak tropical depression barely distinguishable from ordinary summer rain. Even in that diminished state, the remnants carried enough moisture to raise concern that heavy rain could still reach the Korean peninsula in the days that followed, a final, faint echo of a storm that 2 weeks earlier had not even existed as a name on a forecaster's chart. In the days immediately following the Zhejiang landfall, recovery crews across the province worked through standing water and downed timber to restore power and clear roads, while officials continued monitoring swollen rivers for the kind of secondary flooding that so often causes more lasting damage than the initial storm itself. Insurance assessors and disaster response analysts who later reviewed the event noted that the sheer scale of the evacuation, nearly 2.5 million people, moved with almost no loss of life directly tied to the landfall, stood out as one of the more effective large-scale storm responses of the season, even as the broader human cost of Bavi's overall path, concentrated so heavily in the landslide-prone hills of the Philippines, remained severe. The storm's remnants were still being watched carefully by Korean forecasters even after the formal dissipation announcement. A reminder that a tropical system's official death on paper does not always mean its rainfall stops posing a risk to the people living beneath what is left of it. The remnants of what had once been Bavi did not vanish immediately. Weather models tracked the leftover moisture and weak low-pressure signature as it drifted northwestward and then curved poleward and northeastward, eventually working its way toward the Yellow Sea, the shallow body of water separating China from the Korean peninsula. There, over several more days, whatever coherent structure remained finally broke apart entirely. The storm's full and final dissipation was recorded on July the 16th, 2026, more than 3 weeks after that first shapeless cluster of thunderstorms had been spotted drifting over warm water east-southeast of a small atoll in the Marshall Islands. From formation to final dissolution, Bavi's life spanned roughly 3 weeks. But its most violent chapter, the eyewall passing directly over Rota at 901 millibars, had lasted only a matter of hours. When the full accounting was done, Typhoon Bavi's legacy was measured across an extraordinary stretch of the globe. The Northern Mariana Islands and Guam, the Philippines, the Ryukyu Islands of southern Japan, Taiwan, and finally mainland China, with its remnants reaching all the way to the Korean peninsula before disappearing entirely. It was the 9th named tropical storm of the 2026 Pacific typhoon season, the 3rd typhoon, and the 2nd storm that year to reach super typhoon intensity while striking the Mariana Islands, following Sinlaku only months before. Meteorologists who studied the storm afterward ranked it among the strongest tropical cyclones ever to strike a United States territory, a distinction earned in the space of a single violent night over a small island most Americans had never heard of before that week. Its human toll was concentrated overwhelmingly in the Philippines, where landslides and flash flooding tied to the storm's outer bands killed 23 people and left 18 more missing, a toll built entirely from water rather than wind. In Taiwan, more than 100 people were injured, almost all of them in falls and accidents caused by the wind and rain rather than direct structural damage. On Rota and across the wider Mariana Islands, the damage was described by local officials as touching nearly every piece of infrastructure the community depended on, even as the strength of modern building codes, hard-won lessons from past storms, kept the loss of life remarkably low given the intensity of what had passed directly overhead. What makes Bavi worth remembering is not simply that it was strong, because plenty of storms reach Category 5 and are forgotten within a season. It is the shape of its entire life, an unremarkable cluster of storms over open ocean that, given nearly perfect conditions, transformed itself within 48 hours into one of the most intense tropical cyclones on the planet that year, brushed its maximum theoretical potential intensity over a tiny inhabited island, then spent the following week slowly, methodically weakening as it crossed thousands of miles of ocean and coastline, shedding strength each time it lost contact with warm water and regaining it whenever the conditions briefly aligned again. Its final hours, spent grinding across the interior of eastern China as a disorganized remnant dumping rain on already saturated ground, could not have looked more different from the towering, symmetrical 901 millibar monster that had rolled over Rhoda's 1,900 residents a week earlier. That contrast between the storm at its absolute physical limit and the storm in its last quiet hours as barely organized rain is the story of every tropical cyclone that has ever existed, compressed into a single, unusually well-documented 3-week span. Every hurricane and typhoon that has ever formed follows this same basic arc, drawing strength from warm water, weakening the moment that fuel source is cut off, and eventually losing its identity entirely, whether over cold water, dry land, or hostile upper-level winds. What varies from storm to storm is simply how far up that arc a system manages to climb before gravity, in the form of friction and cooling, pulls it back down. Bavi climbed about as high as the atmosphere would allow that week, brushing against the outer edge of what physics itself permits a tropical cyclone to become, and then it spent the following 10 days coming back down in stages, weakening over the Marianas, partially recovering over the open Philippine Sea, weakening again past Taiwan and the Ryukyus, and finally losing its battle entirely over the wet, saturated soil of eastern China. Forecasters who track these systems for a living often note that the death of a storm rarely makes headlines the way its birth or its peak does, because by the time a typhoon is reduced to a smear of rain on a satellite loop, the news cameras and the emergency broadcasts have usually already moved on to whatever threat comes next. Bavi's own ending arrived not with a dramatic final landfall or a widely broadcast warning, but with a single measured sentence from a national weather agency confirming that the system had, at last, ceased to exist. Bavi was born from nothing over an empty stretch of the Pacific, briefly became one of the most powerful storms measured on Earth that year, and ended as quietly as it began, dissolving into ordinary rain over a landscape it had already soaked days before. Its name retired from the forecast charts the moment the Korea Meteorological Administration made its brief, almost anticlimactic announcement that the storm was gone.